You've noticed it, haven't you? Not something arriving and something no longer happening. The space where a signal used to be, the pause that didn't ask to be filled, the quiet that didn't feel empty. This isn't about receiving messages, or waiting for confirmation, or looking for proof that you're on the right path. It's about what happens after that phase ends, when the usual markers stop showing up, and nothing rushes in to replace them. That moment has been strangely present lately, across different lives, different timelines, different inner landscapes, and yet the feeling is the same. At first it can feel confusing, like you missed something, like you failed to notice an important sign because you weren't paying enough attention. But if you slow down and really check, there's no panic in the body, no urgency, no fear, just a kind of neutral stillness. The waiting isn't tense anymore. It's almost unnecessary. Things that used to feel charged now feel flat. Questions that once mattered don't pull the same weight. You observe yourself expecting something, and then you watch that expectation dissolve on its own. Not replaced, just gone. And oddly enough, nothing collapses when it disappears. You're not behind. You're just no longer scanning. There was a time when signs felt essential. Repeating numbers, synchronicities, moments that felt like winks from reality. They gave orientation, reassurance. A sense that you were being guided, watched, accompanied. And for a while that was true. Not because they held power, but because you needed mirrors outside yourself. But something subtle has changed. The same moments still exist in the world, but they don't land the same way anymore. They pass by without grabbing your attention, without demanding interpretation. You notice them, and then you don't. And that's new. What's unfolding here doesn't announce itself quickly. It tends to make sense only later. Once you realize you stopped looking, there's often a brief phase where this silence feels uncomfortable, not painful, just unfamiliar, like walking into a room where a machine has been turned off and realizing how loud it used to be. The mind may try to restart it, to search for meaning, to recreate the old feedback loop, but the system doesn't respond, not because you did something wrong, but because the function is complete. Completion doesn't always feel like closure. Sometimes it feels like quiet. You might have noticed how effort has changed too. Pushing doesn't work the way it used to. Neither does forcing clarity. Even strong intention feels unnecessary, not useless, just out of place. Instead, alignment shows up as a kind of internal neutrality. Choices feel obvious without being exciting. Movement happens without drama. And when you try to explain this to someone else, the words don't quite land. Because nothing happened in a way that sounds impressive, yet internally everything reorganized. The field you experience reality through has shifted, not dramatically, almost invisibly, like adjusting a lens you didn't know was slightly off. At some point, you may have wondered, did I disconnect? Did I lose something? Why does it feel like the communication stopped? But if you listen closely, the question doesn't carry anxiety. It carries curiosity. That's important. Because fear demands answers. Curiosity allows space. And space is where this phase lives. Silence isn't the absence of guidance. It's the absence of interference. The interesting thing is, nothing external needed to change for this to happen. Your life may look almost identical from the outside. Same routines, same people, same responsibilities. But internally, you're no longer negotiating with reality. You're not asking it to respond. You're not checking if you're supported. You're not measuring signs to decide whether to trust yourself. Trust is no longer an action. It's a background state. And background states don't announce themselves. Around this time, many people notice a shift in identity. Not a reinvention, more like a loosening. Roles feel lighter. Labels don't cling as tightly. You can step in and out of versions of yourself without friction. It's not detachment in a cold way. It's flexibility. The sense of I am this softens into I can be this. And even that doesn't feel urgent. Time behaves differently here, not slower, not faster, just less demanding. Later on, you may realize this wasn't a pause. It was a recalibration happening beneath awareness. You might notice that suffering has changed texture too. It doesn't spiral the way it used to. When discomfort arises, it points somewhere quietly, then releases. There's no narrative punishment attached, no lesson being forced, just information, clean and brief. Misalignment doesn't shout anymore. It whispers, and you respond without turning it into a story. That's new, and it only happens when perception becomes primary. There's also a strange sense of being both deeply individual and subtly collective at the same time. Your experience feels personal, uniquely yours, yet you sense that others, in their own quiet ways, are arriving at something similar, not through shared beliefs, not through shared language, but through the same silence. It's like many versions of self are gently sinking, not in behavior but in orientation. No leader, no message, no instruction, just parallel awareness unfolding independently. You're not being initiated into something. You're remembering how to stand without reference. This is where the idea of signs becomes unnecessary. Signs were bridges, useful when there was distance between you and your own perception. But once perception stabilizes, bridges dissolve. You don't need confirmation when recognition is constant, and that constancy doesn't feel dramatic. It feels ordinary, which is why it's easy to miss. Some people try to recreate the old phase. They look for intensity, for meaning spikes, for experiences that feel special. But specialness was never the point. The upgrade, if you want to call it that, isn't louder. It's quieter. It removes the need to be convinced, and nothing feels missing when that need disappears. You may notice how choice works differently now. Decisions aren't made through overthinking. They're made through resonance, not excitement, not fear. Just a subtle internal yes or no. And once chosen, there's no internal debate afterward. That's alignment, not as effort, but as absence of resistance. When choice feels simple, it's because identity stopped arguing. There's a reason this phase doesn't come with instructions. Instruction implies hierarchy. It implies someone knows better than you, but this shift removes hierarchy altogether. External frameworks lose relevance, even the ones that once helped you. You don't reject them, you just don't reach for them. The field you're operating from is self-validating, not because it's superior, but because it's sufficient. This is often when the idea of parallel realities stops feeling abstract, not as a concept, but as lived experience. You sense that different versions of you are accessible not through effort, but through subtle orientation. What you focus on becomes what feels real. What you stop reinforcing fades naturally, no struggle required. The mirror adjusts as you do. Somewhere in this quiet stretch, you may encounter a familiar thought. Is this it? Not disappointment, not excitement, just recognition. And the answer doesn't arrive in words. It arrives as ease. What clarifies later is why this phase couldn't have been louder. It would have distracted you from noticing it. This is also why the silence feels respectful. Nothing is intruding. Nothing is interrupting your awareness. You're trusted to notice what matters. And that trust didn't come from outside. It emerged when you stopped asking for permission. If you've ever glanced at something like parallel realities and felt it wasn't new information, just familiar territory, that makes sense here. Some things don't arrive as teachings. They arrive as recognition, not because you need them, but because they echo what's already unfolding inside you. There's no finish line to this, no final understanding. The quiet doesn't resolve. It continues. And strangely, that continuation feels like belonging, not to a group, not to an idea, but to yourself, without reference. When awareness feels complete, it stops reaching outward. You may notice yourself revisiting moments from the past and seeing them differently, not with regret, with clarity. You weren't wrong back then. You were aligned with who you were at the time, and now, you're aligned with who you are now. No conflict between versions, just progression. As this video comes to a close, nothing needs to land, nothing needs to click. If something feels familiar, that's enough. If it doesn't, that's fine too. The recognition this points to doesn't depend on agreement. It unfolds when it's ready, and often, it shows up as silence. A silence that doesn't ask questions, doesn't send signs, doesn't demand interpretation, just a steady presence. Still here, still unfolding. Long after the words stop, there's something unusual about this silence. It doesn't ask to be interpreted. When something meaningful happens internally, the mind usually tries to turn it into understanding. But here, it can't. Not because it's too complex, because it's too simple. You may notice you're not trying to figure out what's happening anymore, and that alone says more than any explanation ever could. For a long time, Understanding felt like survival. Naming things kept the ground steady. Explaining was a way to stay oriented in time. Now, that axis has shifted. You still think, you still reflect, but you no longer depend on thought to feel stable. The silence isn't a gap waiting for answers. It's a space that doesn't need to be filled. When the mind stops running, it's not because it gave up. It's because it arrived. You might have noticed that even doubt has lost its intensity. It shows up, and then it leaves. Before, doubt carried identity with it. What if I'm wrong? What if I miss something important? What if I don't recognize the right moment? Now, when doubt appears, it feels unfinished, as if it has nowhere to attach. It doesn't spin stories. It doesn't expand. It doesn't demand resolution. It touches the surface and dissolves. That only happens when the center of reference shifts. There's no longer a constant search for external validation, not spiritual, not emotional, not symbolic. You don't need anything to answer you anymore, because alignment no longer arrives as excitement, it arrives as normality, and that confuses anyone who still associates transformation with intensity. There's a strange kind of maturity in this phase, but it isn't heavy. There's no seriousness, no mission, no sense of cosmic responsibility. It's light. You don't feel the need to use this for anything, or prove it, or explain it. It feels almost too intimate to turn into language, and that may be why the external world seems quieter too. Not because it changed, but because you stopped projecting expectation onto it. When expectation drops, reality stops shouting. Time behaves differently here. Days pass without urgency. Plans exist, but they carry no pressure. The future doesn't pull, the past doesn't tug. There's no sense of, I need to get there. Not because you stopped living, but because you stopped leaving the present. And the present doesn't require effort. This is the part very few people talk about, because it isn't dramatic. After the signs stop, there isn't a big event. There's stabilization, a sense that reality isn't testing you, or rewarding you, or watching you. It simply reflects, quietly, the way you're present within it. And presence is silent. At some point recently, you may have caught yourself thinking, I'm not waiting for anything anymore, and that doesn't bother me. That sentence wouldn't have made sense before. Before, not waiting felt like giving up. Now, not waiting feels like trust, but without a story attached. It isn't everything will work out. It isn't the universe knows. It's simpler than that. It's just, this is happening as it happens. And somehow, that's enough. Something subtle begins to happen to identity here. Not a collapse, not a reinvention, a soft release. You don't feel like you're losing yourself. You feel like you're carrying yourself less tightly. Traits that once felt fixed become optional. Reactions that once felt automatic pause just long enough to be noticed. You can step into a version of yourself and step out again without friction. There's no internal negotiation. Before, identity had weight. It required consistency, defending, explaining. Now it feels more like a setting than a definition. When identity loosens, choice stops feeling risky. You may notice this most clearly in small moments, ordinary ones. Someone says something that would have pulled you into reaction before, and it doesn't. Not because you're detached, because there's no hook. The reaction still exists as a possibility. It just doesn't claim you. And in that pause, something new appears. Choice without effort, not a forced decision. Not a calculated one, just a natural movement toward what fits. This is where the idea of alignment stops being aspirational. It becomes practical. You don't try to align. You simply notice when something feels slightly off, and you don't continue in that direction. No drama, no correction ritual, just a quiet redirection. And because it's quiet, it's sustainable. Reality responds differently here. Not faster, not slower, more precisely. Small choices create clear reflections, not rewards. Not punishments, just mirrors. You don't read meaning into them. You recognize resonance. And because you're not attached to outcome, the reflections feel clean. When you stop negotiating with reality, it answers plainly. There's also a shift in how effort feels. Pushing feels inefficient. Overplanning feels unnecessary. Waiting for certainty feels outdated. You don't need full clarity to move. You don't need signs to proceed. Movement happens when resistance is absent, not when motivation is high. This confuses people who are still measuring progress through intensity, but intensity was never a reliable signal. It was just loud. Here, even silence has texture, not emptiness, texture. You can feel when something is complete without it being announced. You can feel when something is forming without it demanding attention. This is perception working without interference. And interference used to be mistaken for guidance. At some point, you may realize that you're not trying to get somewhere anymore. You still have direction, but it isn't tense. It doesn't lean forward. It unfolds. And unfolding doesn't require belief. It requires presence. This is often when people stop talking about their inner process, not because it's secret, but because it doesn't translate. Language wants structure. This phase doesn't offer one. It's lived, not explained. What can't be explained doesn't need to be shared. There's a quiet confidence that comes with this. But it isn't assertive. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't defend. It simply doesn't question its own legitimacy. You don't wonder if you're allowed to be here. You just are. And that changes how you relate to everything else. Time doesn't feel linear here, but it also doesn't feel mystical. It just stops pressuring you. Moments don't rush into each other anymore. They don't stack. They don't compete. You still remember the past. You still imagine the future, but neither one pulls at you. They feel like rooms you can enter or not. And that choice doesn't feel important enough to analyze. When time stops pushing, you stop resisting it. You may start to notice something else. A strange familiarity with versions of yourself you didn't live out. Not regret, not longing. Recognition. Paths you didn't take don't feel like losses anymore. They feel like adjacent realities. Accessible but unnecessary. You sense that who you are now isn't the result of a single correct path, but of a convergence. Many possible versions gently folding into one stable orientation. And stability here doesn't mean permanence. It means coherence. The idea of my path changes shape. It no longer feels like something you're supposed to follow, or discover, or stay faithful to. It feels more like a field you move within. You don't ask, is this right? You feel whether it fits. And if it stops fitting, you don't frame that as failure. You adjust. No identity crisis required. This is often when people stop narrating their lives internally. The story quiets, not because nothing is happening, but because experience no longer needs commentary. You notice what you're doing without explaining why. You notice where you're going without justifying it. That's when awareness stops splitting itself in two, the observer and the observed. They merge. When observation relaxes, experience becomes whole. Parallel versions of self don't appear as visions, or thoughts, or beliefs. They appear as ease. You sense that other outcomes are possible, and you're not threatened by that. Choice doesn't feel heavy because no single version has to carry your entire worth. Identity becomes portable, and when identity is portable, fear loses leverage. You might notice that even desire has softened. Not disappeared, softened. You still want things, but wanting doesn't feel like lack. It feels like preference. And preference doesn't distort perception. It allows flow. There's a quiet trust operating now, but it isn't faith-based. It doesn't rely on hope, or belief, or promises. It relies on pattern recognition. You've seen enough internal alignment to know how this works, even if you couldn't explain it to anyone else. And you don't need to. Certainty doesn't announce itself. It settles. This is where the absence of signs makes complete sense. Signs were transitional tools. They belonged to a phase where orientation came from outside confirmation. Now, orientation is internal, not as intuition, not as guidance, but as baseline perception. You're not asking reality where to go, you're noticing how you're already moving. And movement here doesn't feel dramatic. It feels ordinary, which is exactly why this phase is overlooked. Nothing is happening, yet nothing feels wrong. Nothing is being proven, yet nothing feels uncertain. You're not waiting for the next signal, because nothing feels unresolved. At some point, you stop checking where you are. Not because you arrived, but because location stopped mattering. There's no internal map being consulted anymore, no sense of progress being measured, no quiet anxiety asking if this is leading somewhere useful. Experience unfolds. And you're inside it, not watching from the edge. When orientation becomes internal, direction becomes irrelevant. You may notice that even awareness has softened, not dulled, relaxed. You're not hyper-aware, not scanning, not monitoring yourself. Attention rests where it rests, and because nothing is demanding interpretation, nothing feels incomplete. This is where silence becomes familiar, not special, not sacred, just normal. Sometimes, something old tries to return, a habit of searching, a reflex of questioning. It doesn't last, because the system that needed answers no longer runs the process. Not shut down, just unnecessary. You don't fight it. You don't correct it. It fades on its own. What no longer serves doesn't need to be removed. It stops appearing. There's a quiet belonging here, but it isn't to a group or a belief or a framework. It's a belonging to your own perception. You trust what you notice. You trust what resonates. You trust what doesn't. And that trust doesn't feel earned. It feels default, as if it was always meant to be this way, once enough noise cleared. Nothing about this phase asks you to do more, or be more, or become anything. There's no improvement project running in the background. Life continues, movement continues, change continues, but none of it feels personal in the old way. You're not being tested, you're not being rewarded, you're participating. If something like parallel realities ever crossed your path and felt less like a book and more like a quiet mirror, that wasn't coincidence. Some things don't add knowledge, they remove interference, and removal is subtle. You don't notice what's gone at first. You notice what no longer needs attention. As this ends, nothing needs to stay with you. Nothing needs to land. If a sense of familiarity lingers, let it. If nothing does, that's fine too. This isn't a message. It isn't guidance. It's a reflection that keeps reflecting, even after the sound stops. Because the silence didn't begin here, and it doesn't end here. It's already part of how you're perceiving, still present, still unfolding, without signs, without confirmation, just awareness, continuing.